All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Becca McCabe. We have Jeep Pagel here, Travis Booms, and Sandra Cuadros in the back. And we are members of the Conference Futures Committee. We've organized this plenary because we believe that science, research, and the long-term conservation of wildlife and natural lands suffers when there is limited involvement of Indigenous peoples. We hope that by bringing the perspectives of these three fabulous panelists, we can listen, we can learn, and ideally find solutions that combine traditional knowledge with Western science in a respectful and ethical way. The plenary kind of is going to unfold today. We're going to have each of the panelists provide a presentation, and then we're going to go into some discussion-based questions from the RRF membership, and then we're going to open it up to a Q&A. So, and with that, we are thrilled to introduce the speakers for this next plenary, Connecting Worlds, Indigenous World Views, Science and Sovereignty in Raptor Research and Conservation.
Thank you, Becca. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce Aimee Roberson. Thank you, Aimee. Aimee is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and a descendant of the Chickasaw Nation. She's the director of the Southwest Region for American Bird Conservancy. Previously, she served as the coordinator for the Rio Grande joint venture, and prior to that, worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. With a bachelor's degree in geology and a master's degree in conservation biology, Aimee focused on raptor research early in her career, including studying and learning from peregrine falcons, swallow-tailed kites, various species of owls, and northern goshawks.
Thank you. I am thrilled to introduce Tiana Williams-Claussen. She's a member of the Yurok tribe and comes from the village of Whale on the Yurok Reservation. She currently serves as a department director for the Yurok Tribe Wildlife Department. She received her bachelor's in biochemical sciences from Harvard University, returned to serve her tribe, and is currently pursuing a Master of Science in Natural Resources from California Polytechnic State University. Tiana's graduate work focuses on lessons learned and pathways forward to successfully integration of federal, tribal, and state legislation in pursuit of restoration of California condor to Yurok ancestral territory.
Hello, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Robert Mesta. Robert Mesta is a longtime friend of many of us here. I've known Robert for almost 40 years. He is an amazing person.
I'm not that old.
He is one of the kindest, gentlest, and most thoughtful biologists I've ever met. He is a member of the Yaqui tribe. He comes with many distinctions. He was the coordinator of the peregrine falcon recovery team. He was the coordinator of the California condor recovery team. He was the coordinator of the masked bobwhite recovery team. He also was the coordinator for the Sonoran joint venture, and he is now the director of the Liberty Wildlife Non-Eagle Feather Repository, which provides feathers to tribal members for ceremony purposes and religious purposes. Robert, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So, thank you for the opportunity to be here and address a subject that's both very, very important to me personally and professionally. So, the first thing I want to say is the slide you're looking at has nothing to do with my presentation. I just ran across it when I was putting my program together, and it's a great demonstration of, or it gives new meaning to the hazards of doing S climbs. That what comes to mind to me. Okay, connecting worlds, Indigenous World Views, Science and Sovereignty, and Raptor Research and Conservation. That's a mouthful. It's a very there's a lot there, and what we hope to do, which is kind of unfold it and provide you enough information that it becomes of interest to you, and you start thinking about it when you're designing your conservation or research projects. Okay. Okay, before the European settlement of North America, indigenous people used to hunt, fish, farm, and roam the many diverse and productive environments of the North American landscape. They would often they would migrate, basically, often moving seasonally to take advantage of good weather, the availability of game, animals, and to harvest both edible and medicinal plants. Throughout their history, indigenous people have maintained a very close, very important, and relationship with their environment and the animals it supports, and also the plants, and especially birds of prey. I know that's not a bird of prey, but yeah. So this is a favorite quote of mine, and I think it succinctly puts it all together for me. The donning of feathers is a celebration of an ancient connection. Spirits are joined, and the dancer assumes the attributes and the power of the bird they become. This relationship between indigenous people and their environment defined and continues to sustain our cultural identity. A culture that believes that both humans and animals walk in the same world. Now, a point of clarification, the phrase that I just said, believes that both humans and animals walk in the same world. That's what you call Indian speak. It basically means we share the planet and the environment. Not that we walk around with animals. Anyway, okay. A world where animals, plants, trees, rivers, and mountains all possess a spiritual essence that must be recognized and respected. Cultural anthropologists have a name for this worldview. They call it animism. The longevity and intimacy of land occupation allowed generations of indigenous people to accumulate a body of knowledge, beliefs, and practices that would sustain them both biologically and spiritually. This knowledge is passed on from generation to generation, woven into our cultural heritage through legends, stories, ceremonies, songs, dances, and beliefs. As you can see, it's a very, very important part of our culture. Okay, this knowledge now has a name. Can you believe that? All right. It's called traditional ecological knowledge. That's a mouthful. It's often sometimes referred to as native science or indigenous knowledge, sometimes local knowledge, but I think we've all come to the agreement that it's traditional ecological knowledge. And even though it has a fancy title now, it does continue to be the foundation that supports the holistic and sustainable indigenous worldview that defines us. So, TEC, traditional ecological knowledge, is defined as a cumulative body of knowledge and beliefs handed down orally through generations by cultural transmission, by societies with historical continuity, in resource use practices, knowledge regarding the relationship between all beings and their environment. So, how does tech stack up with Western science? Okay, when we're talking about tech, we're talking about oral tradition, Western science, Western written tradition. Tech has a holistic approach. Western science, more of a reductionist approach. Tech is learned from observation and experience. Western science taught and learned mostly analytically. Tech is environment, part of the cultural and spiritual relationships. Western science, hierarchical and compartmentalized. Tech is based on the cumulative collective experience. Science based on laws and theories. Tech is mainly qualitative. Western science, mainly quantitative. Data generated by resource users, data collected by specialists or experts. Tech, long time with one location. Western science, short time series over large areas. And finally, a tech is integrated and applied to daily living and traditional subsistence practices. Western science, hypotheses testing, and model building. Neither is better than the other. They're just different, but I believe that they're complementary. And yes. Okay. Okay, so I couldn't give a presentation at RRF without having a raptor. That was taken on the North Slope of Alaska by my dear friend Ted Swim, who can't be here, but he says hello. Okay, so what's happening with tech? So what we're doing at this time is that we're exploring and collecting this knowledge and learning how to apply it to contemporary environmental challenges, either as a standalone application or in conjunction with current Western science efforts in a reciprocal, a relational, and relevant way. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here now because I think the timing is so right to introduce the concept of combining these two types of sciences, if that's what you want to call them, because they certainly enhance the work that, or will enhance the work that you do. I think sometimes we can zero in and get focused and forget about stepping back and giving a worldview that allows you to realize that the importance of what you do, not just on a biological level, but on a cultural level. To those cultures, those societies, and those tribes that maintain relationships, perhaps with the animal that you're studying. I always say that the conservation of any species is more than just the preservation of a gene pool. You know, the preservation with the preservation of that particular species comes the preservation of those societies and those cultures that evolved with that particular animal. And whether they realize it or not, or recognize it or not, depend on it for the health of their cultural environment. So I'm starting to rattle on here. So I'm just going to give up the podium here to Aimee. I didn't give any specifics, but that's because my colleagues here are going to provide you with that. And thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Alito Sahushifo at Aimee Roberson, Chata Michachikasha Ohoyosia. Hello, my name is Aimee Roberson. I'm a Choctaw and Chickasaw woman I'm currently serving as the director of the Southwest Region of American Bird Conservancy and based on Tiwa homelands in northern New Mexico. And I want to say that we regret that we do not have representation from one of the pueblos or tribes in New Mexico. We did ask around to a few folks we knew who unfortunately were not available this week. But hopefully we can remedy that in the future. Today I want to talk to you about lessons from Indigenous lifeways and our feathered relatives. But first I want to thank the conference organizers, my fellow panelists, and all of you for the opportunity to speak with you today and for your interest in Indigenous perspectives. And I have to say it's really fun to be in a room full of raptor enthusiasts. I have never been to this conference before. And while I don't often use hashtags on social media, my favorite is Raptors Rule. Feel free to use that. And really, this is a full circle moment for me. I studied goshawks with Pat Kennedy and David Anderson for my master's degree and presented on that work at the Cooper Ornithological Society meeting many moons ago here in Albuquerque. So it's great to be here with you. In his book, Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, Tyson Yunkaporta of the Appalachian Clan in Australia defines Indigenous people as those who have a cultural memory of a sustainable way of life on the land base their ancestors occupied. He notes that each of us, all of us, have Indigenous roots somewhere. Some of us are just farther removed from them. My own Indigenous roots are with the Choctaw and Chickasha people, and I am an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I also have ancestors from Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England, further removed from their Celtic roots, who settled in the homelands of our people in the 1700s. We are descended from the Mississippian mound builders. We are sister tribes in the Muskogean language group, and our homelands are in what is now known as Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Tennessee, with hunting grounds that extended far beyond these areas. We were traditionally matrilineal and matrilocal, and our traditional foods were and are from hunting, gathering, and agriculture, including the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. From our Mississippi mound builder ancestors, we inherited a cosmology and worldview in which everything is known to be interconnected. Intertwined with this worldview is the knowledge that we do not own the land, but rather we own the responsibility to care for it. And we recognize all life forms, animate and seemingly inanimate, as our relatives. Broadly speaking, Indigenous lifeways and traditional ecological knowledge are rooted in place and sacred relationship with the earth, sun, sky, water, plants, and animals, and nurtured and shared through culture, ceremony, stories, and language. The benefits of kin-centric ecology are reflected in reports from the United Nations that ecosystems stewarded by Indigenous people retain the highest measures of biodiversity. Indeed, as our elders tell us, it is from our relatives who are Indigenous to a place that we must learn how to be in balanced relationship with Mother Earth and all our relatives. For example, in traditional Choctaw villages, our people practiced kin-centric ecology and cared for the other than human beings who shared their homelands as relatives. This painting reminds me of the relationship my Choctaw ancestors and that we currently have with Uskipata, which are dense river cane breaks. These used to stretch for hundreds of miles along stream terraces in the southeast region. The cane breaks provided many environmental benefits, including erosion control, protecting water quality, and providing habitat for native birds, fish, and other wildlife. My ancestors depended on the cane for making blow darts, baskets, flutes, clothing, and more. And so they honored these relationships and stewarded the ecosystem using fire, which allowed the cane breaks and all the beings that depended on them to thrive. In fact, my ribbon skirt today is patterned after a traditional Choctaw basket weave design. This is something that's still very important to us to this day. Sadly, these canebrakes are now considered an endangered ecosystem. And one of our feathered relatives that also depended on them, Bachman's warbler, has disappeared, along with these other birds, Carolina parakeet, the passenger pigeon, and the ivory-billed woodpecker, who shared our homelands at one time. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, resulting in my ancestors being uprooted from our homelands, forced to walk what we called the Trail of Tears and Death to Indian Territory, which is now known as Oklahoma. My ancestors were among the first to be removed from our homelands, and many died along the way. But many other indigenous peoples followed. So not only the southeastern tribes who were the first to be removed, but also the Long Walk of the Navajo, the genocide of California tribes, the Northern Cheyenne Exodus, the Potawatomi Trail of Death, just to name a few. In response to the federal government's Indian removal policies in 1827, my seventh great uncle and Chickasha chief, Levi Colbert, admonished the US government while expressing his anguish over the deracination of our people. We never had a thought of exchanging our land for any other, as we think that we would not find a country that would suit us as well as this we now occupy, it being the land of our forefathers. If we should exchange our lands for any other, fearing the consequences may be similar to transplanting an old tree, which would wither and die away, and we're fearful we would come to the same. Newspapers from the period describe Choctaw women as they set out, gently touching the trees of their beloved homeland and telling them goodbye. The ongoing process of colonization has caused displacement, disconnection, and fragmentation of our people and lifeways. We, along with the land, water, and entire ecosystems, are forever changed. So there's a long history that we do not have time for today, but it includes things like the Dawes Act and allotments and forcing tribes to change from a communal land governance system to private property and boarding schools and many other things that I won't get into details about today, but are important factors from history. So although my ancestors' journey and the realities of creating a new life in a new homeland were extremely challenging, this art by Choctaw artist Karen Clarkson is to me a hopeful reminder of the resilience of our people when they arrived in Indian Territory and as they continued to face the ravages of colonization. And now, here we are in these times of crisis. Climate change, ecocide, declining biodiversity, social inequity and injustice, many of us wondering how we can make a difference. One thing we can do is to look to Indigenous people for leadership, including how to survive an apocalypse. Well, while my degrees in geology and conservation biology help me to understand some things about these crises, my perspective as an Indigenous woman gives me a deeper understanding of how they are all connected. Today, I want to share some of this with you because I believe that an understanding of Indigenous lifeways and values can help us envision and create a better future for all of us, birds and people alike. I'm a founding member of a group called the Indigenous Kinship Circle. This group emerged out of a collaborative conservation initiative called the Central Grasslands Roadmap, and we are creating a cross-boundary community of practice for Indigenous people and allies working to advance the well-being of our communities across the Central Grasslands in Canada, the US, and Mexico. We have developed an Indigenous World Views statement that I would like to share with you. With respect and reverence for our ancestors, we hold sacred the places where we live and the kin-centric ecological systems on which we depend for our identities, lifeways, nourishment, and well-being. We accept the responsibility of being good stewards in reciprocal relationships with all beings and work together to facilitate healing, connectivity, and redistribution of knowledge, time, and resources within our communities. We are guided by the 7 sacred teachings: love, respect, courage, honesty, wisdom, humility, and truth, in collaboration towards the restoration of cultural values, beliefs, practices, and relationships that were disrupted by historical and ongoing acts of colonization. We like to say that we are rekindling Indigenous kinship roots. So Indigenous people are certainly not a monolith. And while there's tremendous diversity across Indigenous lifeways, a concept of indigeneity has emerged from decades of collaboration with Indigenous people around the world. The 4 R's are core values that are common to many Indigenous cultures: relationship, responsibility, reciprocity, and redistribution. These values help us to be good stewards of our communities and ecosystems in sacred kinship with all our relatives, whether human, bird, or tree. During the course of my own life, birds have been important guides and have provided me with an understanding of these values. As children, my siblings and I learned about our relationships with the world around us, and every spring we were delighted to see mama ducks emerge from their nests and make their way to the pond next to our house with fluffy ducklings in tow. Most of them were hakolba, mallards, but occasionally hilak, wood ducks, nested nearby. One year, my dad rescued 3 mallard ducklings whose mother was hit by a car. As surrogate mamas, my brother, sister, and I gained a greater awareness of the delicate balance of the pond's ecosystem. We noticed the remains of other ducklings eaten by an owl, turtle, raccoon, or a cat. With our parents' guidance, we took good care of the ducklings until they were fully feathered. The day we released them to the pond was bittersweet, but we knew it was right. From the ducklings, we learned about our kinship obligation, the profound sense that we human beings are related not only to each other, but to all things, animals, plants, and rocks, including the stars. Along with this, we recognize that everyone in this extended family is valued and has a contribution to make. As a young adult, Oskanankobi, the peregrine falcon, led me to the Rio Grande Basin and taught me about responsibility. During my first job as a wildlife biologist, I canoed through Santa Elena Canyon on the Rio Grande and Big Bend National Park. We were observing Oskanankobi, then an endangered species. We woke before dawn to climb from our riverside camp to the top of the tall canyon wall and look across at the Erie on the Mexican side of the river. As I watched and listened intently, Oskanankobi wailed, taking her first flight of the day and locking eyes with me as she crossed the canyon toward us. I was mesmerized as she flew above the canyon walls, tightly hugging the Rio Grande, flowing between 2 countries and through the middle of my heart. Oskanankobi was revered by my ancient mound builder ancestors, representing strength, long life, family, and a long line of descendants. Ironically, I had come to the Rio Grande to observe our avian relative because widely used pesticides such as DDT were impacting their ability to reproduce. Observing the decline and eventual rebound of Oskanankobi after banning DDT, plus breeding and releasing birds back to the wild, which I was able to assist with one summer in Montana, taught me about our community obligation, our responsibility to care for our relatives. Several years ago, our birdkin and my role as the Rio Grande Joint Venture Coordinator brought me back to our traditional homelands and helped me to experience the essence of reciprocity. I attended a meeting of migratory bird joint venture coordinators on Chickasha homelands in a place now known as Memphis, Tennessee. After the meeting, I journeyed to central Mississippi, our traditional Choctaw homeland, stewarded to this day by the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. The Mississippi Choctaws' persistent resistance to removal, resilience, and continual acts of community care allowed them to stay in our homelands. They were finally recognized by the US government in 1945, more than 100 years after my ancestors were uprooted. I visited our mother mound, Naniwaye, the central place of creation and emergence that connects all Choctaw people to a homeland. Although at the time I did not know any humans there, I was greeted by many relatives, including fakets, wild turkeys, walking across the field, and fala, American crow, calling from the trees, while tishkila, blue jay, bishkomak, northern cardinal, and hatak lithposh, red-shouldered hawk, responded. Biskinik, yellow-bellied sapsucker, the little Choctaw newsbird, drummed, announcing my presence. Reconnection with my homelands lit a spark in me that intensified my learning of our lifeways and language. After my visit, Jason Lewis, who works for the language program and the Department of Choctaw Aimee, or Lifeways, for the Mississippi Choctaw, asked if I would help with a dictionary project. He explained that they needed someone who knew about birds to help them match Choctaw names gathered from various historical sources with common English names used today. Many of the Choctaw bird names describe the bird, its activities, or its sounds. So in some cases, I was able to match those descriptions with the common English and Latin names of birds, or at least provide some hints. Jason and his colleagues are taking this information as a starting point to elders who speak Choctaw Anumpa fluently and may remember the use of the bird names that aren't commonly used today. I felt honored to share my knowledge of birds and to give something back to our Choctaw people as well as our bird relatives. This was a wonderful opportunity to practice reciprocity, our cyclical obligation to contribute to the cycle of life and care for our community. One of the birds whose name was not lost, Kofi Nukshopa, northern bobwhite, has taught us about redistribution. In sacred kinship, the Mississippi Choctaw continue to dance in honor of this avian relative. Kofi Nukshopa shares our traditional homelands and also the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma's reservation. The Kofi Hila, the quail dance, helped revive our culture and reconnect Oklahoma Choctaw with Mississippi Choctaw, from whom they relearned dances, songs, and customs in the 1960s and 70s. In this way, Kofi Nukshopa has taught us about redistribution, our obligation to share not only material wealth, but also time, talent, and knowledge. Each of the 4 R's is integrally related to and builds on the others. Indigenous people understand that relationships define our roles and shape our responsibilities. And we realize that these relationships, roles, and responsibilities are reciprocal in nature and lead to the redistribution of assets, both tangible and intangible. Lately, the Northern Goshawk has been teaching me about another R, resilience. Last year, the Hermit's Peak Half Canyon fire raged from early April to late June in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains here in New Mexico, burning more than 341,000 acres. My family and I watched the enormous smoke plumes build each day, wondering if the fire would jump the ridge and come closer to us on the days that the wind shifted. We were fortunate that that did not happen, but ultimately it was the largest and most destructive wildfire in the history of New Mexico. A few months ago, we visited an area near Serpent Lake that was on the edge of the burn. In this place, the fire had burned in a patchy way, creating a mosaic of burned and unburned areas. And on this beautiful summer day that we visited, we were heartened to see the aspens trees regenerating, an incredible diversity of wildflowers blooming, so many birds, including a lek of dusky grouse and a northern goshawk hunting over the burned area. As mentioned, my master's thesis was on northern goshawks, and so these fierce birds have a special place in my heart. And I was absolutely delighted to see this one. It really got me thinking about the concept of resiliency. What does it look like for us, people and birds alike, to be able to adapt to a changing world and a changing climate? What conditions are needed for us to continue to survive and hopefully thrive? I'm looking forward to hearing Dr. Pat Kennedy, what she has to say tomorrow in terms of goshawk conservation. Pat was one of my advisors, so come back for that, of course. Indigenous people have actively participated in the kin-centric ecological systems on which we depend for identity, culture, nourishment, and well-being since time immemorial. We can think of this as Indigenous social ecological systems. Examples include management of disturbance regimes through cultural fire, bison grazing, and other practices. This stewardship of prairies and grasslands, for example, allowed bison and birds to thrive along with people. And all of these things are vital components of food sovereignty for Indigenous people. Through social ecological relationships and Indigenous science, knowledge is acquired, verified, and shared, contributing to practices that support ecosystem health and resiliency. The thing is, resilience is needed for all communities. Social ecological resilience cannot exist if the social resilience of one group is being advanced at the expense of another. Through the process of colonization, Indigenous social ecological relationships were disrupted through assaults on communities, cultures, languages, food systems, movements and migrations, and kinships. Western settlers established policies and institutions to reinforce their own resilience while oppressing Indigenous people and disrupting and suppressing our lifeways through removal, forced assimilation, boarding schools, and more. In spite of continual injustices, Indigenous people survived. Our lifeways, though in many cases fragmented, persist, and our people have never stopped working to maintain our resilience and sacred interconnections. Allowing Indigenous communities to thrive and reconnect with our homelands and ancestral kinships will increase resilience for us all. Chickasha author Linda Hogan writes in her book, Dwellings, A Spiritual History of the Living World, as an Indian woman, I question our responsibilities to the caretaking of the future and to the other species who share our journeys. It is clear that we have strayed from the treaties we once had with the land and with the animals. It is also clear and heartening that in our time there are many, Indian and non-Indian alike, who want to restore and honor those broken treaties. From an Indigenous perspective, we all have responsibilities to be in right relationship with our human and other than human relatives. These relationships are based on treaties or agreements to collaborate and respectfully work together. These agreements are made in perpetuity for as long as the sun shines, the grasses grow, and the rivers flow. And in fact, many of the treaties made between Indigenous nations and the Canadian and United States governments include a phrase like this. Sadly, all of the treaties with Indigenous nations have been broken by these colonial empires. It's important to all of our futures that we recognize that we are all treaty people. Not only does the integrity and honor of our country depend on upholding treaties with Indigenous nations, the future of Mother Earth, our home, and all our relations depends on this too. We have an obligation to respect the sovereignty of Indigenous nations and amplify Indigenous voices and actions. We also need to support the restoration of the connection of Indigenous people to their ancestral and current homelands, waters, and relatives through rematriation, land transfers, and co-management with governmental entities. There are some really exciting examples of this happening these days. This will contribute to the process of reconciliation and healing the generational wounds inflicted by colonization. And it will help us build a better future for all of our children and many generations to come. I'm grateful to be here to learn and carry on the Indigenous values and lifeways of my ancestors as I work to conserve our feathered relatives and the ecosystems we all depend on. And I thank you for your interest in these things too. I wanted to, we'll probably maybe can bring this slide up again at the end, but I do have some, if you want to learn more, if you want to dig into these topics, yeah, maybe take a screenshot or a photo. These are some books that I recommend. As well, Kyle White, who is an Indigenous philosopher and climate environmental justice scholar, is a prolific publisher. This article, Towards Reconciliation, 10 Calls to Action to Natural Scientists Working in Canada, also applies to the US very much, and highly recommend that for scientists and researchers wanting to work with Indigenous people, First Nations or tribes or Pueblos. And then the last one, I wrote an article that goes a little deeper into some of the things I've talked about today. There's a URL there, but if you Google my name and Lessons from Indigenous Lifeways, you'll surely find it. So, Hachia Koke Lihoke, I thank you all very, very much. These are some of the artists who were featured during my presentation, and thank you.
So Ayekwe Nikichu, I'm so happy to be with you all today. Nakna Tiana Williams-Claussen esti. Wechko me umechak bulik me. My name is Tiana Williams-Claussen. I come from the traditional village of Wechko, and I'm a Yurok tribal member. And I'm incredibly grateful that you all are here and interested in this topic. I'm incredibly grateful to the organizers for the conference to have us here, and of course, incredibly grateful. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to follow that up, but hopefully we do really well all together. But I'm going to kind of extend the conversation a little bit and kind of give a case study of what it looks like to work in coordination with Indigenous people, particularly the Yurok tribe in this case, and even to have Indigenous leadership when it comes to raptor conservation. They're talking about what has truly been the realization of a dream, which is that Preganish, the California condor, flies again in Yurok skies after 130 years absence. So I'm going to describe a little bit who we are. Probably most of you know who Condor is, but there'll be a little bit of talk there too, and how we came together once again after this long distance. So the Yurok tribe is actually the largest tribe in California with about 6,500 members, and we are very far north, almost to the Oregon border. Our traditional homelands, which thankfully they couldn't push us any farther west, so we got to keep ours. I'm incredibly grateful for that. Our reservation starts at the mouth of the Klamath River and extends 44 river miles along the river. It's kind of that orange boundary that you see in the middle. And that's kind of where our jurisdictional authority is strongest. It's where we can actually make laws as a sovereign nation in how we want to manage the lands and our community members, our wildlife and fish and plants and all these sorts of things in order for the benefit of the whole. The red boundary that you see that's kind of larger than that is actually our ancestral territory. And our reservation is only about 10% of our ancestral territory, but we never ceded our moral obligation to be caretakers of the whole of ancestral territory, which really highlights the need for partnership between Indigenous and external entities, whether they be federal, states, industry, or conservation partners, to help meet the restoration needs of our homeland. So in particular for the Condor program, I want to highlight the Redwood National and State Parks. You can kind of see the lighter sort of green that's on the left side of the map there. They not only overlap with our reservation, but through a considerable portion of our ancestral territory. And so between the two of us, when we brought this to them in 2007, we said we want to bring condors home for the cultural and ecological integrity of our homeland, but we think that this fits well within the conservation needs of your entity as well. And so in 2007, they enthusiastically agreed to partner with us, and now we formed together the Northern California Condor Restoration Program. But ultimately, this was a tribally driven initiative.
And it was actually a panel of our elders specifically tasked with identifying natural and cultural resource restoration needs who prioritized condor preganish as the single most important species to return to ancestral territory, largely because of his cultural importance and his ties to what we consider to be our foundational reason for being, which is as world renewal people. So I actually really love this piece of art by our local artist, Lynn Risling. She's actually Karuk, Yurok, and Hupa descent. So I will largely be speaking from the Yurok perspective, being a Yurok tribal member, but this world renewal ethic is something that is shared throughout the tribes in our area and into the Pacific Northwest, and probably by many other as well. But condor in particular is important to our world renewal ceremonies, which are the highest of our ceremonies. And that's what this image depicts, our white deerskin dance and our jump dance. And so these are ceremonies that we hold every 2 years, and they help us bring the world back into balance by putting that good energy out there through our prayers, through our songs. And these ceremonies are actually led by the condor song, which in our stories was given to us back in the beginning of time before humans were even really the people of the world. So we look at condors as an elder spirit, not an inferior, not a quote unquote animal, whatever that means to you, but someone who is not only equal, but more knowledgeable and wise than we are. He provides his feathers and through them his spirit to the dance. We believe him to be very kind-hearted, to have a very pure and powerful spirit that actually comes from the fact that he does not partake in killing. That gives him that spiritual strength within our cosmology. And we believe that because he can soar the highest, about 15,000 feet, we figured that was the one to get our prayers to heaven when we were asking for the world to be in balance. And so while we are no less world renewal people in the absence of condor, to not have condor in our landscape has been deeply, both ecologically, culturally, spiritually, devastating to us. So as world renewal people, I would say that our ethos can be encapsulated in the Yurok term, we take care of the world with the understanding of the world being not only the physical world, but all of the waters and the airs and the animals and the fish and the plants, not only their physical representations, but their spiritual selves as well, internal and external. So everything, my grandpa, sometimes in a smarty way, sometimes in a very wise way, used to always say, you gotta be thinking all the time, depending on how stupid you had just been. It was how nice or not he said it. But literally, we're taught that everything that we do, everything that we say, everything even that we think is either going to positively or negatively impact the balance that we're seeking to maintain. So that said, a little bit of an introduction to condors. They are a giant obligate scavenger. They are a vulture. I think that they are wonderful. And if you want to contribute to us, they're very fundable as well, Scott. Thank you very much. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. They're admittedly not quite as pretty as the snowy owls are, but they're super cool. They're actually the largest land-based bird in North America with a wingspan of 9 to 9.5 feet. They can weigh as much as 25 pounds, and we say that their lifespan is 60 plus years because we literally haven't been studying them long enough to know how long they can live. I believe the oldest California condor right now is 57, and we know that their near cousins, the Andean condor, can live as much as 80 years. They also are large soaring birds. They fly about 100 to 200 miles in a day, which also emphasizes the need for partnership because you don't release them right here and expect them to stay where you put them. They are very good parents. This is one of the things that they teach us. They form monogamous pair bonds, and they actually only have one egg every other year, which they will incubate for 58 days and which will not fledge for about 6 to 7 months. It takes a while to grow into a 9.5-foot wingspan. They will actually keep that chick with them for the full cycle of the 2 years. And once they fledge, they will follow their parents around to learn everything about the landscape that they can, where the good water is, where the good food is. And at the end of which, their parents, I always laugh when I think about this, their parents actually kind of like shoo them off into a roving kind of pack of other juveniles. And I think about it as a roving pack of teenagers going across the landscape. But it really highlights the social nature of the birds because each of these juveniles will bring the knowledge from their parents and share it with the other juveniles, thus strengthening the integrity of the flock overall. This has been an extremely effective sort of path for them throughout much of their history. But in contemporary times, this low natural reproduction is tied with high mortality, which has not only put them on the endangered species list, but is currently still keeping them on the endangered species list. In fact, by 1982, there was only 22 condors free flying in the entire world. And as many of us probably aren't surprised by, many of the mortality factors associated with them come from humans, and they came post-contact. So particularly in California, with the California gold rush, there was just a huge influx of people that the system had not evolved with and was not built to sustain. And there was also the introduction of a different sort of way of engaging with wildlife that was significantly less relational and was significantly more extraction, or viewed animals and plants and waters as a resource to be used for the benefits of the newcomers. So there was a major reduction in megafauna through not only more people, but the introduction of market harvest. There's direct human take of the condors in a much larger way than any indigenous populations would have done. There was habitat loss in our area. That was the raising of the old growth redwood forest. They used those for nesting, as well as the loss of a lot of the traditional prairies that tribal people in our region maintained through traditional fire. There was poisoning, where people would put poison out for carnivores, condors would eat them and die. And there's actually, while many of these things have been remedied through the changes made in conservation over the 20th century, if not remedied, at least improved, there are still two issues that remain a problem for condors, which are DDT contamination and lead toxicity from the use of lead ammunition, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But ultimately, it drove the then very controversial decision to bring all remaining condors into captivity, because they had not fully identified why their populations were plummeting, in order to regrow them and hopefully be able to reintroduce them and figure it out and then help them thrive. It was very controversial, but ultimately quite successful, with new birds being born in captivity within just a few short years, such that by the mid-1990s, they were actually re-releasing condors into the wild. And if you have any questions, this is the guy to talk to about that, because he was heavily involved. But as of December 2022, there was 561 condors, 347 of which were in the wild. So I'm going to move on a little bit to what I see as the contemporary role of condors in our world. It's one of my simplest slides to look at, but one of my most complex to talk about. So we'll see how this goes. But I see condors as both an ecological and cultural keystone species. And so probably most of you here are familiar with the idea of an ecological keystone species. There's different definitions, but I tend to favor one that says a species that has an inordinate impact on the environment within which it lives, despite a relatively small size. Vultures obviously fall into that. They are incredibly important as scavengers, as cleaning up the landscape. We can unfortunately look to the situation in India, where there was a massive die-off and just all the problems that went with that. I don't really like to put ecosystem services into dollar values, but they estimate it as literally billions of dollars in ecosystem services. A cultural keystone species is a species that has an inordinate impact on the cultural development of a people with which it shares space. And I think you can see why that was the case for the Yurok people. They are deeply invested in this idea of renewal, both from a practical ecological standpoint and from the spiritual standpoint. But I would like to expand on that and say that they are actually a cultural keystone species for the broader conservation community. And I'm going to try and describe why there's not that much difference between ecological and cultural keystone species in my mind. But condor, of course, is one of those incredibly iconic success stories. They got down to 22 individuals. They were on the first listing of the the Federal Endangered Species Act, which, by the way, is 50 years old this year. So yay, USA. But they really epitomized what we can do if we come together, even on a species on the clear brink of extinction. And so even though there are questions about, well, was this worth it? They're still on the endangered species list. They're still endangered. How much have we learned from it? How much have we learned how to work together? How much positive change have we seen from investing in this sort of work that then extends to other endangered and threatened species? There have been preserves created for condor. There's there's bilateral support in Republican and Democratic houses to support the ESA because we can say, look what we did here. In California and in Arizona, there has been Arizona and surrounding areas, the Southwest, there's been this huge push for outreach about the #1 cause of mortality in condors, which is lead ammunition. I'll talk about more. There's been a ban placed in California on the use of lead ammunition for hunting that will not only benefit condors, but a whole host of species. They are driving us through their relationship with us to make a better world. So they are driving us from that cultural perspective, but they're driving ecological improvement as well, making them both an ecological and a cultural keystone species in my mind. They're also an excellent indicator species. So they are an apex species. And so I always say that if you have a healthy and vibrant environment that supports condors, you have a healthy and vibrant environment to support everybody. And conversely, if condors are declining, you really need to see what's going on, because that means the rest of the world is in deep peril. So a lot of the things that we saw impacting condors impacted a whole host of other species, and in fact impacted even us as humans, which is, a narrative I think that all of us here can say, that what impacts the world impacts us as humans. We are not external to it. We are a part of it. And so we need to be looking to our wildlife relatives and say, hey, what's going on here? But they suffered from reduction in megafauna. We suffered from the loss of our traditional foods and practices related to them. They were considered a lesser species that it was okay to kill. We were considered a lesser species that it was okay to kill and to steal our children and kind of rewrite them. They suffered from habitat loss. We suffered from removal from our home, not to the extent that other tribes did, but I'll tell you what, when you can't get to your ceremonial high country, when you can't get to the lands that used to sustain you, when you can't maintain them, it becomes very hard to maintain who you are as a Yurok people. It's the ground that grounded you literally has been taken out from under your feet. And there was introduction of a huge variety of new poisons and toxins like DDT and lead. For us, it was alcohol and disease, as well as things like DDT and lead. Their decline epitomized just the incredible amount of destruction and chaos that came with the sweeping in of colonization post-contact. In fact, I'm always moved by the fact that as condors were disappearing from our landscape around the turn of the 20th century, so were we at risk of our highest of ceremonies going extinct, our white deerskin dance, our jump dance, because they are illegal, because they are dangerous. The two largest massacres in our region, hundreds of people dead, happened during these high ceremonies because everybody came together for them. And so it became not only illegal, but unsafe to practice these things. And my mother lived through the generation of her parents did not want to teach her what it was to be Yurok because it was not safe. But the concerted effort to kill us in every way was not successful. And so I really like to highlight the story of the white deerskin dance in particular. One of the eldest of our elders was actually a leader in reinstituting the white deerskin dance after many years, having been one of the few elders at the time to have danced the dance in his youth. And he actually was the elder. I mean, there was a vote, but pretty much everyone agrees that he was the elder on our tribal park task force that said, we need to bring condors home. And everybody, because of his ceremonial and cultural and spiritual leadership, said, yes, we need to bring condors home. And so both things were brought to the brink of extinction. He passed just a few scant years after white deerskin dance was reintroduced. If we had waited just that much longer for condor restoration, they also would have passed from this world. Both of these were saved because of our respective loves for healing the world, whether it was condors or whether it was our culture, or whether it was both. People came together to make a difference, meaning that partnership is just so incredibly important to these sorts of works. That said, I'm going to transition a little bit to the Western science part of things. We've had a lot of conversation about what traditional ecological knowledge is, and of course, there's a lot of facts that could be pulled from it. More importantly, I think from a tribal perspective, relationships is what you're going to pull from traditional ecological knowledge. But Western science provides a very powerful set of tools for looking into what the world looks like now. Where RTEK was developed over the course of millennia, the world has changed hugely over the last 150 years for us. And science allows us to get those snapshot pictures of what it looks like now so that we can adapt. And so when it came to condors, we actually worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a feasibility analysis for what it would take to bring condors home, including a habitat analysis. And so the map up here is an example of an analysis that we did based on condor life history needs. So there was roosting, nesting, foraging, flight corridors. This in particular is flight corridors, with the blue and the green really highlighting the high levels there. But each of the maps kind of duplicated this. And one of the reasons for that potentially for condors is that they're so adaptable, and they're so good at using the wind, so that so long as they can get from point A to point B, they can find the resources that they need. And a lot of the things that had impacted in the first place, like the loss of the game animals, have been rectified through conservation measures in our region. The rather boring graph in the corner is actually our assessment of DDT. And so some people are actually really surprised that DDT is continually a problem for condors, because of course we banned the use of it in the 1970s, and a lot of avian species have recovered from its reproductive problems. But the issue with DDT is that it is a persistent organic pollutant. So our oceans are still very much contaminated with it, and it's bioaccumulative. So for long-lived blubbery animals like whales and sea lions, they're actually building DDT up in their system, and when they die, they become a source for condors. And so they are actually impacting the Central California flock managed by Ventana Wildlife Society. In a 2014 study, they were actually finding that about 50% of their eggs still suffered from DDT. So the way that we looked at that was by capturing blubber samples from every marine mammal we could find, but particularly adult male California sea lions, and then doing a comparative analysis of how DDT looked. And you can see a very clear downward trend from Southern California, that big red bar, down to Oregon. So thankfully, the farther that you move north, the lower the DDT levels seem to be. And so Central California is actually that central bar there, and we found that our levels were about 4 times lower than their levels in California sea lions, which doesn't mean that we won't have an issue, but I'm very hopeful it means that we won't have an issue. Lastly, we looked at the issue of lead ammunition contamination. And so lead mortality is actually the #1 cause of condor mortality in the wild for those animals where we can determine mortality at about 51%. So about 51% of the birds out there are dying from lead contamination. And the way that it's getting into the system is through the use of lead ammunition, which is the most conventional material for ammunition. But it's a soft metal, and it actually impacts and fragments into hundreds of pieces, as you can see in this radiograph of a deer harvested with it. Humans, it may or may not be an issue. We've got a digestive system that's relatively fast. It passes through our system. The CDC still says do not feed children under the age of 5 with game harvested with lead ammunition. But for condors and other raptors who rely on scavenging for food, this is getting into gut piles, which hunters are leaving behind, and which normally is a very important role that hunters serve, especially in places where the carnivore populations have been depleted and humans are kind of stepping into that. They're incredibly important part of conservation. But when these gut piles are studded with lead, they are a death knell. A piece as small as a head of a pin is enough to kill a condor, as well as a bald eagle or a golden eagle or other raptors that might feed on it. And so we did, again, a comparative analysis looking at turkey vultures and common ravens as our nearest neighbors who are actually still extant in our region. And the good news is that of turkey vultures, for example, our levels of incidence of elevated blood level were lower than any place else in California that turkey vultures had been studied. But it is telling to say that still 24% of our turkey vultures had elevated blood level, nearly 1 in 4. So we knew even early on that we needed to start remediating this. And following the example that had been started by many others within the Condor Recovery Program, we started our Hunters as Stewards project with the idea that we wanted to reach out to the strong conservation ethic amongst mangrove hunters, provide them with information about this impact, and ask them to partner with us. And so in the surveys that we did, about 85, depending on the event, and we did all kinds of events, 85 to 95% of the hunters we talked to said, first off, no, I had no idea this was an issue. I didn't know this was an issue growing up as a hunter. But second off, of course, now that I do know, I will voluntarily make the switch to non-lead ammunition. That has since grown to be an actual ban on the use of lead ammunition in California. There's pros and cons of voluntary outreach versus bans, but ultimately lead does have to get out of the system. And condor was kind of the species that's leading the way on that, though it will have a huge benefit for other species as well. But this partnership approach was kind of our partnership approach all the way through. And so
believe it or not, some people don't want to see a new endangered species in their area. It can impact not only industry, but federal and state management, as they have to kind of adapt their management and thinking and rewrite things and all this sort of stuff to incorporate this species. So we took the same approach. This is what we would like to do. It looks like it's going to be for condors. What are your concerns? How do we address them? How do we move forward in a good way? And ultimately, this resulted in a memorandum of understanding between 16 partners, federal, tribal, states, industry, nonprofit, and conservation groups, saying that not only was it good for condors for them to return to our region, but this region would benefit by condors' return. So ultimately, this will be a bit persnickety, but it's actually really important for tribes. The Yurok tribe, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service acted as co-leads to the environmental assessment to bring condors home. Now, this is important to tribes because historically, while there are regulations that say that federal and state entities have to consult with tribes, consultation is not co-management, and they can consult, get information from tribes, and completely ignore it. They are under absolutely no obligation to do anything about it. Co-leadership means that we were recognized as actual leaders in this decision-making process, that we are exercising our sovereignty as a government to be a part of this decision. And that is very rare in the way that people work with tribal people. I only know of 2 instances. I think maybe 3 now. There could be more, but it's rare. So if you happen to be from a federal or state agency out there, I would love to talk to you about how we can expand those sorts of relationships. But ultimately, because of the partnership building, the preferred alternative was to release them as a non-essential experimental population under the Section 10J of the Endangered Species Act, which allows you to custom craft conservation measures to support the needs of the species while helping them integrate better with the broader community. And of course, condors being so adaptable and knowing the #1 cause of mortality. Matter of fact, I forgot to say this, statistically, if you get let out of the issue, we can probably stop managing condors because they're so awesome. Anyway, ultimately, this resulted in a 6-year process, literally thousands of comments. It was quite the to-do, but we received our finding of no significant impact in March of 2021. And by May of 2022, we were releasing our first condors back into the wild, resulting in the newest release area in 19 years following Pinnacles National Park. And so the map kind of displays the big kind of latitudinal jump that this was for condors, helping them go back up into their historical range, which used to go up to British Columbia. Not only will the lower human impacts in the area hopefully mean a healthier and more abundant, maybe not more abundant, but a healthier population that has to have less intervention, but potentially we'll have climate change benefits as well, as we're kind of latitudinally in the middle of their traditional range. But I do want to emphasize that this was built on the work of a century of people who loved condors, who studied them, who wanted to do everything that they could do to save them. And we were able to step into this when the time was right for us to incorporate all of that knowledge and passion and love into our own restoration efforts. So that was incredibly important, but also the Indigenous voice, which was the leader to bring condors home to this region, was important because nobody else was going to do that. It was a many years conversation for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to even become interested in this. Each of our birds, again, here comes the Western science. I love this sort of stuff. Each of our birds is outfitted with transmitters and tags. One is a GPS tag that allows us to give an overall assessment of how they're utilizing the landscape. They also all have VHF tags so that our teams, which are monitoring them daily, can go out and get eyes on our birds and make sure that they're doing well. Not only allowing us to keep track of the birds, but also integrate with land management in our area to say, hey, you've got a condor. Let's talk about it. What does that mean? We conduct biannual trap-ups and as needed. In the spring and the fall, we actually just finished our fall. And this includes physical checks, transmitter and tag maintenance, and then also blood draws, historically largely focusing on the lead issue, but now also things like swabs and the like for studying highly pathogenic avian influenza, which if you guys have been following the condor story, unfortunately hit the Southwest population pretty hard. But the collection of all this data kind of brings a final thing, and it's a fiddly bit, but it's going to be deeply important for anybody who really wants to work with tribes, which is data protection.
So a lot of tribes have been burned when people came to them for information, either in the name of TEK, again, looking for facts as opposed to relationships, so not really having the right understanding of what TEK was, but then using it in ways that was not beneficial to the tribe or the regions or could actually hurt them. And so tribes are very sensitive over that. And when it came to condors, we are sensitive about the data that condors are producing because we consider them our community members. I would not, publicize where my daughter moves, from day to day. I don't want to publicize where condors are moving from day to day. We do want to share information. We want the community to be regularly engaged, but it has to be vetted in a way that protects the species. And so we are currently working through our concerns over the Federal Freedom of Information Act and the California Public Records Act, which is California's version. And we are working to assert our tribal sovereignty in this through first one resolution, which is a tribal law, which designates the Klamath River as a cultural riverscape and protects all species native to the river, and a resolution which designates Preganish as a cultural resource and historic property. And the intent is to provide data protection under the Yurok Cultural Restoration Protection Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, the National Environmental Protection Act, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and California Environmental Quality Act. We've got a lot of support from the biologists we're working with. The legal teams are harder to convince. We're still working through that. But I definitely encourage that if you work within these spheres, be thinking of solutions rather than barriers to how do you work within your own system to make these sort of things happen. Ultimately, and we're getting to the end here, I know I've gone long, what we're looking for is reincorporating condors back into the ecological landscape, which they had evolved to be within, and which, with so many benefits, both to condors and to the lands. And we want birds without tags. We don't want to be maintaining this forever. We want them to be healthy and well. But not only are we fitting them back into the physical or ecological space, but we're fitting them back into time, taking the dreams of our ancestors and our elders and bringing them to fruition, realizing them for our children. So this is my daughter. She's in here because she's super cute and I just think she's the best. But I did not grow up knowing how important condor was. That was something that was held in reserve by the people who kept the high ceremonies in the time of fear, where they kept that knowledge banked until it was safe to teach it again. I did not grow up with condor as a part of my world, but she learned the word Preganish before she learned the word condor. She pretends to be a baby condor hatching out of an egg. That's her favorite thing for some reason right now. They are always going to be a part of her world, and if we're successful, of her children and their children and their children. I'm going to close with a particularly inspiring piece. This was taken by Joseph Brandt, who works with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service down in Southern California. You'll recall that at one point there was only 22 condors free flying in the world. And of course, there are 22 condors in this snapshot right here, which is just so inspiring and encouraging to me to what we can do when it comes to raptor conservation. So, deepest of thanks. It looks like I got cut off a little bit there, but if you want more information about our project in particular, we do have our website, and we also maintain a Facebook page, and we have a live cam. So if you just Google or whatever your preferred search engine, Yurok Condor Cam will pop up, and you can visit with our birds. Thank you.
We want to thank the three of you for sharing your knowledge with us. And I just want to kick off the question section. So I'll hand it over to you guys then, to the audience. But as a product of academia myself, and not really being exposed to integrating TEK into my research world, I kind of wanted to ask you, and maybe other people in the audience are thinking this as well, as a researcher, a scientist who wants to include TEK in their work moving forward, like, where do you start? If it's not something that's already integrated in the work that you're doing, can you speak to that? And if you have any additional resources that you could share?
Yeah.
Oh, separate.
You want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, well, tech isn't for everybody, but it's certainly valuable enough that I think that if you have an interest, that you should explore the possibility. The first place you go is to the literature. That's not very exciting, but there is a lot out on tech. You can go to your federal agencies. All Fish and Wildlife Service regions have a Native American liaison that will work with you on something just like this. I mean, that's what they're paying them for. And there's one right here in Albuquerque, if you happen to live in the Southwest region. There's also, as Amy pointed out, there's a lot of books out on the subject. But that's all background, you know. The hard part is how do I connect? You know, how do I find an elder that might be interested in what I'm interested in? You know, that is not the easiest thing in the world to do. First of all, there's not that many elders, and chances are they don't have phones. I know that experience. But I mean, you can reach out to like the Native American Wildlife Society. They meet regularly, and you meet here in the Southwest quite a bit. You know, attending those meetings, you know, getting to know those members, and eventually maybe identifying someone who might be able to answer your questions or might be interested in your project, your research, or conservation you have in mind is a good way to go. These days, all the federal agencies have tech programs. Some of them have full-time staff, and depending on the nature of your project, you know, whether it's contaminants, of course, EPA would reach out to, and we do have staff. If it's land-based, it happens to be publicly owned, you can reach out to BLM, National Park Service, Forest Service. They have staff, and they have commitments to check, and so that's another level of outreach, but you haven't actually got to that person yet, have you? And but that will lead you to that person. Even in fact, it is an elder that you might want that might be appropriate to be part of your research project. But it might be on a tribal level that we get Indigenous participation. It can even be a group or a community within the tribe that might be appropriate outreach. And so I didn't have a focused answer for you, but it takes some work. It does take some work, but I think the resources are out there, you know, both within the literature and then active employees with various agencies, and also tribal members that, you know, eventually will get you to that point where you can talk to somebody and see if tech works for you. Do you want to add to that? Okay.
I think one of the most important things about traditional ecological knowledge is that it's not really a thing, that it's a way of life. It's a way of knowing. It's a worldview. It's embedded in a worldview and the life ways of our Indigenous people. And so it's not something that can be like extracted and plugged into your research. And so it's important to raise that and to emphasize what Tiana and Robert have both said is that it begins with relationships, right? And so going to the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society meetings, whether regional or national, is a great way, like Robert said, to see what's going on, what the tribes are interested in terms of wildlife, where you might have common interests. Also going to almost all First Nations tribes or pueblos have public events. Go to them, get to know your neighbors, get to know the people in the research area. That's a great way to start. I think too, once you develop those relationships, is to realize that really this is about, again, not extracting, not taking something, but co-production. And so ask yourself, what does that really mean? To me, that means as a researcher, building those relationships, going into a community and asking, what's important to you regarding condors or goshawks or whatever it is that you're interested in studying. What is the value of that species to the people that you want to work with, and what questions do they have where you have some common ground? And then furthermore, if you get that far, is to be sure to, there's some literature out now, I can't remember the name of this article I came across recently, but talking about new ways of citation that can incorporate oral history and oral knowledge and not just scientific papers. And so we need to be thinking outside the box about that, about including the people you interview or are in co-production with as authors on everything you do, maybe including them even as a first author, depending on the situation. And being very sensitive to that relationship, the investment of that person, those people in the ecosystem, in those relationships with the raptor or other species that you're interested in. I was thinking it might be interesting to hear from you, Tiana, about since you work for your tribe, about do you have an IRB process or different kinds of things that might be parallel to what folks are used to in academia or in government in terms of setting up agreements on how you work with researchers.
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that. I do want to briefly add as well. I think these are all wonderful resources. When you're talking about literature, I mean, literally you can go into whatever your search method is. I often go into Google Scholar, and you can look up TEK or your tribe that you're trying to work with or the region that you're trying to look with. And it could well be that there are specifics to the region that you're trying to work with. I also want to emphasize to not forget the non-federally recognized tribes. So your federal agencies are going to be probably pretty helpful in identifying your federal tribes. Their databases sometimes need updating, but they can at least give you a direction. But particularly in California, where we have such a density of tribes, all of them really are recognized by the state of California, but only a certain percentage by the feds. And so that's going to add a layer of complexity. You can work with your state representatives as well. They are growing in their capacity, at least in California and probably elsewhere, to meet with those tribes, but don't forget about them because they are just as tied to the lands that you're working with. In terms of the Yurok tribe, we're a pretty large organization at this point. We're relatively young as an actual government. 1993 was when we were established as a formal government, and our natural resource department and cultural departments have been growing ever since. We have both a natural resource lead and we have a cultural lead. So if you're looking for someone to start you there, you can call the front desk and say, I would really like to talk to natural resource or cultural resource. They're probably going to have one or the other. Even a very small tribe, these are going to be priorities for them. So they're probably going to have one or the other, and they can give you guidance on how to move forward. For us, like I said, data management is a big thing. So we actually have a legal team that helps us flesh through, what are the uses for this? Is this beneficial to the species? We don't do science for science sake. We do things only that are going to benefit the species in the region. We have a culture committee. A lot of times, if it's relevant, we'll ask you to come and speak to the culture committee about whatever you want to do. Is it culturally okay that you want to do this? There's the natural resource committee, which is kind of the management side of things. And then ultimately we have a council process where you get final approval to go through it all. And depending on your project, you may or may not need to go through all of these different things, but there's different mechanisms in the different tribes, different processes that they might have that they'd ask you to go through. The one thing I would also say is be persistent, not obnoxiously so, but be persistent, because we all have so much that we want to do, and most of us have limited resources. So I love when people reach out to me. I'm a horrible email correspondent because there's so much on my plate. Please don't feel like I'm ignoring you. Ask again. I'm not going to be offended, and we really do want to work with people outside of our own tribe.
I want to just add one more thing on this topic. There's a book that was published this year that I forgot to add to my slide, but is a great compilation of examples and case studies of traditional ecological knowledge and how it's often paired with Western science. It's called Wildlife Stewardship on Tribal Lands. Our Place is in Our Soul. The editors are Sarah Hoagland, who was one of the folks we were hoping would be able to join us this week, but was unable to, and Stephen Albert. So that's a really great resource that gives lots of case studies and examples of this sort of thing.
Well, we know it's noon and people might be hungry. So we just wanted to thank Robert, Aimee, and Tiana for, again, sharing their perspectives with us. We're going to stick around for an extra 5 or 10 minutes. So for those of you that want to stick around and ask some questions, please do. But we wanted to give everybody else the chance to get up and leave if they wanted to. So
before you leave, I want to say this is one of the coolest things I've seen at a Raptor Research meeting ever. So thank you very much.
thank you. So if somebody has a question, feel free to just yell it out. Yes.
I'm wondering if there's a
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I will.
Coming up.
She's coming.
Yes. The role. Yeah, it's smart.
You're gonna say, you had to just speak with the microphone.
I'm wondering what's next. Because
Yeah, you got to, sorry.
Okay, I'm just asking, I have great admiration for the tribes ability to step up and manage wildlife that my society has not done a good job with. And I wonder what sorts of critters you're thinking about next on the list to bring back culturally and ecologically.
That's right. You can say.
Oh, well, I can speak to the, general region of Northern California, of course. So for us, we've got a lot of interest in beaver, of course. They're ecosystem engineers that are much wiser than we are about how the land needs to look and things like that. But a lot of and fish out the wazoo. I mean, we've got an amazing fisheries department. And if anybody's interested, check out the Klamath Dam Removal Project. It's the largest dam removal project in US history. And there's all kinds of stuff that goes along with that. But as I've come into my directorship, I'm actually 3 years the director. My real focus is going to be on habitat restoration for holistic restoration for a variety of species. And so, for example, our forestry department is implementing forest practices that are restorative, but they're not necessarily there for extraction, but for these lands that we purchased that are overly dense, that are monocultures that do not support a diversity of species or even a limitation of species. Well, we're going in and we're thinning, we're making sure to preserve a variety of species so that they can grow. We're going to be re-implementing fire to manage the undergrowth and support the health of those trees. Similarly, our prairie and wetland restoration is going to be a benefit not only for our ungulate populations, but our prairie birds, for species like condors who rely on these prairies for the foods that they need. So really, that's our next steps. I know our Tolowa tribe right next to us, we're interested too, but I think Tolowa is farther along the way. Wants to reintroduce the otter to our region as well. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and I think a lot of exciting work that's coming up.
For my tribe, for Choctaw, as well as many other tribes across the northern and southern Great Plains, I think bison is probably one of the best examples, where many First Nations are coming together to restore bison as a keystone species in the landscape. So that's a really good example. And then show the river creeks. Very important to, I think, all of the southeastern tribes. There's a whole working group now, focused on that ecosystem, and tribes are engaged with that. A friend of mine from Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma just finished a fellowship with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, along with a few other folks, looking at how to use cane as a cultural indicator in conservation as part of CCAS, which is, I think, the Southeast Climate Adaptation something. That was very exciting to me because a recognition from the Western conservation community that it's important to consider cultural indicators that interconnect with our ecosystems as well. So that's, I think, one to watch. Do you have anything to add?
I would just. Say. My people like a deer people, so I don't have any birds that I can bring up. But I think the obvious challenge that we hear about that relates to a charismatic megafauna that's out there that needs some attention, that will be controversial, is the buffalo. It'll hit your screen.
Thank you for that question.
So, Robert and the panel, eagles are incredibly important to all tribes across North America. Eagles, of course, have different perceptions from the over 500 tribes, recognized and unrecognized. How can you bring co-leadership with regards to golden eagle conservation throughout North America? How would you proceed with that so that there were co-leadership on that conservation of that species with all of the tribes throughout North America, both in Canada, in Mexico, and the United States?
Oh my God.
I'll let you start.
Well, that's a very good question. And I think that Indigenous people can play a very significant role in the conservation of the golden and the bald eagle. The bald eagle is doing pretty well, they are efforts. The golden eagle not so. I think that I think it'd be appropriate to put together a tribal working team. First starting out with I don't think it serves the Lincoln, and I think we probably review the golden, but I think that if you start out with a national team and have it evolve to tri-country, which would be appropriate. I think that would be a start. And I think that would be a really good way to introduce tech to the process of dealing with the conservation of the species that has such a large range and complexity of threats and challenges. But I think that would be one way to perhaps bring more light to the subject from a different point of view, something that maybe the general public could relate to, which would ultimately end up with more support for the project. That kind of.
I mentioned the Indigenous Kinship Circle that's emerged out of the Central Grasslands Roadmap effort, and golden eagle is one of the species, the indicators that has come up for sure. I think when thinking about like 574 or six, I think, federally recognized tribes, and then additional Indigenous groups that are not federally recognized, it's pretty overwhelming to think about how do we get everyone behind something. And so, one of the things that we're doing, like in the Indigenous Kinship Circle, is looking to places where, tribes are already coming together, alliances, Indigenous-led NGOs, because, you know, one of my colleagues has this analogy about conservation in tribes, and it's sometimes been hard to get some tribes like interested in grassland conservation per se. And so even like our Indigenous kinship circle, we're like, how do we get more tribes officially engaged? And what she says is, you know, it's like if your house is burning down and someone comes to you and says, hey, I've got a lawn service, can I cut your grass? So I was on a call with some pretty high-level folks at Fish and Wildlife and DOI that early last year, and they were talking about traditional ecological knowledge and have since come out with some guidance. But they were saying, you know, what does it look like to incorporate TEK, or I think they're calling it ITEK, into governmental decision-making? And there's no simple answer, but what really came to me after thinking on it for a few days is that that looks like full reconciliation. That looks like making tribes whole so that they do have the resources, the capacity, the strong natural resources, the visions, programs, so that they actually can participate. It includes sometimes providing stipends and travel funds, and thank you all for covering travel this week so that we could be here. But I think we have to, you know, what I talked about and Tiana and all of us about, you know, we are still recovering from the oppression that came with colonization. We are not whole. We are clawing our way back to our traditions in whatever way we can. And so, you know, we need support so many different ways. And so when you're thinking about approaching a tribe or Indigenous people to get them involved in something, be very mindful about, you know, how is it going to benefit them? How can you make that easier for them to participate? How can you break down some of those barriers?
Well, the three of them will be sitting around. So if you do have questions, feel free to approach them throughout the conference. Yeah, we have to wrap it up. But thank you again.
Thank you.